Hello and welcome to Atlantic Debrief, the Atlantic Council Europe Center's internet show and podcast on the most pressing issues impacting transatlantic relations today. My name is Jorn Fleck. I'm the Senior Director of the Europe Center here at the Atlantic Council. And my guest today is Ed Owen, founder of the Power Test podcast, a senior strategic communications and political advisor for several members of the UK Labour Party's shadow cabinet, and someone who served as a special advisor in successive governments, Labour governments under Tony Blair in the United Kingdom. Ed, a warm welcome to the show.
Great to be here, Jorn.
We'll dive right in. On July 4th, Britons head to the polls to elect a new parliament, 650 MP seats up for grabs. If the polls are correct, this general election could bring an end to 14 consecutive years of Conservative Party rule in the United Kingdom. By contrast, the Labour Party is expected to win big, and even the Liberal Democrats and Green Party are expected to make electoral gains of their own. What is behind these electoral dynamics and trends as we head into the election? What could these elections mean for the UK's foreign relations, especially with the United States and Europe? Well, there's a lot to unpack, so let's dive right in, Ed. And maybe to jump right in at the top, maybe give our audience a sense of what the key trends and dynamics are that you are following and that the audience, international audience, ought to be aware of when it comes to the UK elections later this week.
Yeah, thanks, Jorn. So, as you've reflected, it is extremely likely that the Labour Party in the UK is going to be elected with a big majority. We don't like to use Americanisms of supermajority. We tend to use the word landslide in the UK, and I think all indications point to the fact that the Labour Party will win a significant landslide in Parliament on Thursday. That's they currently in the opinion polls, Labour Party is running at about 20 points ahead of the ruling Conservative Party, who, as you say, have been in power in the UK since 2010, either ruling alone or in the first few years in a coalition. But it looks extremely likely that will be the result. That is it's been extraordinary, historically extraordinary result, not least because the Conservatives in the last election in 2019 won a supermajority of their own, of 80 or 90 seats under Boris Johnson. And so for the Labour Party to turn that around in such magnitude is historically unprecedented in the UK. So it's going to be a big moment. What's interesting to some extent is that this is a overwhelmingly a vote of rejection of the Conservative Party. Even for those of us who are pro-Labour and have worked with the Labour Party, we would be stretched to say that this is an overwhelmingly positive vote for the Labour Party. That said, Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party, has done a lot to change the Labour Party in the last 4 years since he was elected leader, and has certainly positioned the Labour Party as a moderate, mainstream, centre-left party, which has inspired confidence and has obviously enabled a number of those people who did vote for the Conservatives in 2019 to feel secure about voting for Labour this time. And as I say, it will be a big majority. And you could see potentially a majority for the Labour Party this time, which is greater than that Tony Blair won in 1997, which itself was a record-breaking victory.
So you've already touched on it a little bit. What's driving that landslide, to use UK terminology, that the likely landslide for Labour? What are the sort of key issues that are driving voter choices, voter sentiment in this election?
It's overwhelmingly, as I said, a rejection of the current Conservative government. There has been absolute chaos in Britain, as many of Atlantic Council observers from afar have been probably watching. It's been a horror show, in truth, within the UK itself, with a succession of Conservative prime ministers. We're now on our third Conservative Prime Minister since 2000, the early 2020s. So it gives you a sense of the merry-go-round which is being played out in the UK. So there's that come on the result of the implosion of the Boris Johnson leadership, which followed extraordinary events during the pandemic of Partygate and various other misdemeanors which were carried out in government at that time. And really, there's been a significant decline of popular support for the Conservatives, which then was particularly catalysed by the disaster of the Liz Truss premiership in Britain. Liz Truss took over from Boris Johnson after this Partygate scandal back in October 22, and famously lasted for barely 50 days in power. As many of you will know, was outlived by a lettuce in the popular jargon. I'm happy to explain if that it means nothing for you. But the general, where Liz Truss attempted a completely economically crazy approach to reduce taxes in the context of what is a very tight fiscal environment at the moment in the UK. And the markets reacted terribly, and she was forced out. And that then resulted in Rishi Sunak, the current Prime Minister and Conservative Party leader, taking on the reins of power. And he's been effectively caught really for the last 2 years, trying to sort of stabilise the British economy while maintaining this uneasy alliance that's existed in the Conservative Party between those who are more centrist, more what we say are one nation conservatives, and the increasingly vocal and energetic part of the Conservative Party, which wants a more red meat form of populist right-wing politics, which is reflected about what reflected in many ways the politics that's happened in America in recent years, and we're seeing something of that played out in the Conservative Party, and Rishi Sunak has simply failed to manage that extraordinary fissure within the Conservative Party, both ideological and other fissures. And the result is that the Conservatives are extremely unpopular. So there's an extraordinary appetite for change and for rejection of the Conservative parties, but the party that has obviously been enhanced by a considerable public concern about the economy and the cost of living, as other governments in the Western world have faced. So there's a problem of incumbency for the Conservative Party. Other issues that have been particularly relevant: immigration continues to be a big issue in Britain, and that has driven, talking about the issues on the right, has driven support for the Reform Party. And we've had the return, as you know, Nigel Farage to the British political scene, only weeks after saying that he was going to sit back and observe and would spend his time campaigning in the US. Well, he changed his mind within a few days, and he's now standing and leading the Reform Party, which has taken considerable support away from the Conservative Party, which is the perfect storm for Rishi Sunak and the Conservative Party. But Jorn, I think you were going to ask.
I was going to ask you about exactly that, the sort of wild card dynamic of Nigel Farage deciding to jump in, boosting the profile of the Reform UK party, and what that does to the everything right of center in the political spectrum for the Tories, and both in this election immediately, but also maybe what transformative effects that can have more medium to long term on the political right.
Yeah, I mean, it is, and Rishi Sunak has faced the perfect storm in many ways in this election campaign, and he called the election 5 weeks ago partly as an attempt to an element of surprise. It was very much the timing of the election was not one that was predicted, and so. But what that has done, and so in history it was recorded as a terrible decision, even though it was was made as that surprise snap election call. What that's done is to return, as you say now, Nigel Farage to mainstream politics in Britain, and so the Conservatives have been losing support both to the left, to the Labour Party, and to the right, to the Reform Party. The result of that will be in our electoral system in Britain, which is, the first past the post constituency-based parliamentary system, will be that the Reform vote, which nationally is hovering around 15-16% in the opinion polls, will mean that there'll be a swathe of Conservative MPs that will lose their seats and effectively allow the Labour Party in, which is one of the arguments that the Conservative Party is using against the Reform Party, which is saying if you vote for Reform, you're going to let the Labour Party in. But such is the level of disillusionment and disenchantment amongst towards the Conservative Party that is having little effect, and the Reform Party will, it seems likely to gain a considerable 15-60% support nationally. The impact that that's going to have longer term is going to be really interesting in the sense that you could have a situation. Some of the opinion polls are suggesting this. You could have the Conservative Party reduced to figures, a number of seats in the maybe 60 or 70 parliamentary seats, which would be extraordinary reversal from, as I said before, from 2019, where the Conservative Party won 300, almost 400 seats. So to be reduced in that way is an extraordinary catastrophe for the Conservative Party. Alongside that, you could have Nigel Farage himself and maybe a couple of other Reform candidates elected to the Conservative Party. There'll be a strong, I suspect, within the activist space and both parties, a strong post-election, a strong move to try and reunite those parties, to reunite the right. And the price of that will be for a more red meat, populist, right-wing Conservative Party. It is possible. You might even see Nigel Farage, which I believe has always been his hope, that you could almost imagine the possibility that Nigel Farage himself may well be elected leader of the Conservative Party in due course. Now, that would be an extraordinary move for the Conservative Party, which has always been, for 150 years, has been a powerhouse in British electoral politics from the centre right. For it to move in the way that would imply to a party which is much more situated on the right and far right of politics, anti-immigration, low tax, much more muscular and populist right-wing party. For that to happen would be an extraordinary change in British politics. And the result of that would be to effectively concede the centre ground to the Labour Party, only, I would have thought, enhancing the Labour Party's chances of not just one term of government, but probably likely two or three.
You already, shifting to the Labour Party, you already mentioned that it's voter sentiment is very much one of change, of anti-14-year Tory rule rather than a pro-Labour switch. What does that mean for Labour's political agenda if this landslide comes true? What can we expect from a Labour Party agenda in terms of priority actions from a Labour government?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Keir Starmer has moved the Labour Party considerably since being elected as the leader of the Labour Party in 2020. The Labour Party was led by Jeremy Corbyn before 2020 from the far left of the Labour Party, and so really the last 4 years, Keir Starmer has been moving the Labour Party to a much more mainstream centrist position on a whole range of issues. And so there was a phrase that Roy Jenkins, a former British Home Secretary, will be known to many, used about Tony Blair before 1997, where he talked about Tony Blair resembling a man who was carrying a priceless Ming vase across a highly polished floor. So many have used this reference to characterize Keir Starmer and the Labour Party's approach in this election, which is to be very cautious, to be very conservative with a small c on fiscal and economic policy, and to tone down a sense of any radical change. Yet alongside that have been campaigning on the focus around change. And so there's a sort of paradox, if you like, about politics at the moment in Britain. And you could actually have a very, I think, a very interesting and potentially difficult issue, both for the Labour Party and for British politics generally, is that you could have the scenario, which is perfectly likely from Thursday. You get a very, very big majority for the Labour Party in Parliament, and yet that doesn't represent a very clear public support for an electoral proposition. So it's a very odd situation in Britain at the moment. The key person in the Labour leadership is Rachel Reeves. She's the shadow chancellor, our shadow finance minister of the Labour Party, and she's been very clear about maintaining very strict fiscal rules, which effectively are saying that their Labour government will be subject to the same fiscal disciplines and constraints that the current Conservative government have established. That is going to be extremely restricting on any future Labour government to spend money. And certainly the Labour Party have ruled out a whole range of taxes that can be used to raise public revenue. So it's going to be very tough. It's going to be a very tough environment. I think Keir Starmer, who is not a Tony Blair, he's a technocratic. He's someone who is conservative by nature. He's very keen to keep expectations low. He has a very strong view about the need to bring competent people into government to replace, to some extent, the chaos of the last 5 years. And he will look to build support and a mandate over time. Now, whether there's a good question about whether actually any government can do that, especially in the context of the international situation and the range of different pressures that now impose themselves on governments. So he will be looking to build sort of public mandate, if you like, for a range of issues. Within that, there are some actually quite radical policies, and it's going to be interesting to see how radical the government will be on. It's many ways. There have been on issues that have not really been aired in the election campaign. Issues around planning reform, permitting reform in the American parlance, about how you can sweep away, which are quite conservative rules in the UK around building houses, building new infrastructure. Labour have committed themselves to making radical change there, which will be very interesting to see how that plays out politically. So, and of course, there are lots of pressures to improve public services. There's public services in Britain, the health service and education are in a poor state. And there will be a lot of pressure for a Labour government to spend and invest in those public services. But as I say, that's going to be constrained because of the fiscal environment. So it's going to be tough, I think, for any government, and particularly one for Keir Starmer. In a sense, that size of the majority, that potentially significant majority has, could make that environment quite even tougher.
Almost run out of time, Ed, but with the plea for a quick answer, what do you think a Labour government would mean for relations with the European Union, right? Post-Brexit, also a key thing that international audiences are watching.
Yeah, I mean, and internationally, you're going to see a Labour government there'll be a consistency in certain policies. I think on a lot of the security issues, on for instance, Ukraine, a Labour government, the Keir Starmer will be coming to the US for the NATO summit in Washington for his first official trip to the US as leader of the Labour Party, never mind as British Prime Minister. He will want to reaffirm Britain's commitment to Ukraine, to the essential Western security apparatus and to NATO. You will see some differences. There'll be a greater emphasis on development policy, international development policy. There'll be a greater emphasis on multilateral action, on working through the UN and other multilateral organizations. And as you've reflected, Jorn, there'll be a move to re-establish relationships with the EU, which have been obviously harmed extraordinarily in the last few years, not least in the context of the background of the Brexit referendum. Labour is committed to restoring relationships with European allies and has also committed to establishing a much greater security partnership with other European partners, particularly within the EU. And that will be, I think, is going to be an area where you're going to see Labour working hard. There are political constraints. There is no suggestion that Britain will look to re-establish its membership of the EU, nor aspects like the single market or the customs union. But there will be significant attempts to build much better relationships where you're going to see a lot closer collaboration and cooperation between the Britain and the EU.
Thank you, Ed. That's all we have time for right now. But please, to our audience, continue to watch the Atlantic Council Europe Centre's coverage of the UK elections, and hopefully we'll have you back, Ed, to discuss the actual outcome and then the outlook. So thank you very much to you for joining us, and thank you to our audience, and see you very soon.
Thank you.